Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on with Maria Bartiromo yesterday on Fox Business, and he discussed China in some detail, certainly reiterating the call for U.S. companies to reevaluate their supply chains, to stop being complicit, say, with slave labor. I'm speaking to you, Phil Knight at Nike. In addition to that, he announced sanctions on some Chinese companies who are part of the persecution of Uyghurs in Western China. And he also addressed the controversy du jour, the question as to whether or not TikTok be banned in the United States, something President Trump was considering, or whether Microsoft should be allowed to pursue its acquisition of TikTok.
Can you really believe that the China surveillance is gone from U.S. operations of TikTok?
Maria, I promise you, the president, when he makes his decision, will make sure that everything we have done drives us as close to zero risk for the American people. That's the mission set that he laid out for all of us when we began to evaluate this now several months back. We're closing in on a solution, and I think you'll see the president's announcement shortly.
And Mayor Lightfoot, by the way, when she heard a possible ban on TikTok, because she's a big TikToker, we're getting a TikTok ban before getting action on life-saving national gun laws. That was directed to President Trump.
The adults are talking. We don't have time for Lightfoot. Also, Mike Pompeo addressing Chinese Communist Party influence operations in the United States, including with respect to the election.
The Chinese Communist Party, and you saw this with our closure of the consulate in Houston, is running espionage operations inside the United States and attempting deep influence targeting of American business leaders, of American congressmen, of city council members. We saw it happen up to a state senator in Wisconsin. This is a deep effort to conduct influence operations to undermine American democracy and put our nation at risk.
There's a good op-ed in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend by Steve Saleen, who's a former race car driver, founder of Saleen Inc. He talks about how Chinese officials hijacked his company. Hey, listen up, big tech executives, at least other than Mark Zuckerberg, who are unaware of China stealing IP or otherwise engaged in industrial espionage. Saleen writes that if trade talks do resume with China, it's more important than ever that any deal protect American companies and their intellectual property from theft by China. My experience doing business in China shows the lengths to which the Chinese government will go to steal American intellectual property. And he recounts his story, which began a few years ago in 2016. He entered a joint venture with the government of Rugao in the Jiangsu province, population about 1.5 million people. That community needed expertise to start an automotive manufacturing company that would create jobs. Saleen would bring his experience, design, engineering, and related technologies developed during his 40-year career in the automotive industry, building race cars and high-performance street cars. His contributions to the deal valued at $800 million. He'd maintain a majority stake in the new company along with his American partners. Rugao would bring $500 million in capital, $600 million in subsidized loans to fund the sites and operations and get a minority stake. He writes, the deal was a sham. It was a trap designed to secure my intellectual property, then use intimidation tactics and lies to nullify the agreement and seize control. And he goes into the detail of how that proceeded. So it's a real thing, even if Tim Cook and Jeff Bezos and Sundar Pichai are unaware of it. For more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation, author of books including Wiki at War and Private Sector Public Wars. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, great to be with you.
So the administration signaling the right tones and taking the right actions, the sanctions that Pompeo announced in regard to China.
So I think one of the things we don't do enough is everybody says kind of China bad now. That's great that we all get that. But we need to better educate ourselves on how China has evolved and changed over time as a threat to American economy. Cyber espionage is a good example of that. Up to maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, essentially China was in the business of stealing economic information primarily over the internet, and they had an army of hackers, and they would just commission people to just grab all this stuff. And like 2015, they began a shift in their tactics, in part because they'd stolen so much. They were actually very competitive us, but economically in a lot of areas. In part because what you could steal wasn't really the most useful stuff anymore, and so they reorganized their hackers to really shift and focus on different targets. That didn't mean they stopped doing intellectual property theft and stopped trying to steal stuff from us. And much more now is in the UMINT thing, which is recently why we shut down the consulate in Houston. And stories like you just told about this guy, right? Squeezing people to get information. But what they're doing on the internet, by the way, it remains a threat, and TikTok's a good example of that. It's really two things. One is just the mass scooping up of all the information they could possibly get, so they can pair that with their artificial intelligence and quantum computing to process all this data and exploit to its advantage. And the other thing is really mapping our systems so they totally understand them. So if they want to go back later and screw with them, steal from them, mess with them, they've got a map of how we operate. So this is evolving, changing. One of the things I like about the U.S. strategy is the kind of things we see Pompeo today is that they're not fighting the last war. In other words, they're staying up with the new threats that China is developing.
Now, President Trump has allowed those talks, or essentially green-lighted to Microsoft those talks to continue, talks of acquisition of TikTok. Do you think, based on the concern that Maria Bartiromo raised in that exchange with Pompeo, that that is the right play, or should Trump move forward and say TikTok is company non grata in the United States?
Well, I think it would be difficult to I don't know. We'd have to go through the legal issues of the authority to do that, and that's a separate question. But the ability to ban anybody's access to TikTok inside the United States, the tech guys tell me that would be very difficult. So having if they sell this to Microsoft and it comes under Microsoft, I think that American consumers, their private information and information on the internet we'd probably be way better off than we are now. I think that's fair.
With respect to the focus on advising American companies about their supply chains, and these stories out, including the one I referenced at the top about Nike being engaged in the use of slave labor for the production of their products. Is the administration going far enough to say, you don't want to be in that business with those people? You don't want to be in business with those people, and who are committing these atrocities, who are repressing people or worse. And so, reconsider. Should we be going further than that with companies like Nike?
So I'd say there's kind of two parts to that. Is the U.S. government doing a lot more in really trying to understand the coercive and malicious behavior of Chinese economic entities and making them available to knowledgeable the private sector? Absolutely. There's tons of that stuff going on. Is the effort as tightly coordinated and integrated as everybody know everything the way they should? Probably not. But we're lightning years ahead of where we were 4 years ago. But the other thing is there's a huge role here for civil society. China is opaque, but it is not a black box. Lots of people are collecting a lot of information on China, a lot of it very, very enlightening. So I think there's a transparency strategy here from both the civil society side and the U.S. government and other governments. It's just the more we bring to light the information about Chinese coercive malicious activity, the more companies will have to deal with that, the more they'll have to respond to their shareholders, the more that they'll recognize the threats to their own company, the more that they'll have to respond to their customers. So do I think there's a lot more that can be done? Absolutely. But again, I would say look at where we were 4 years ago in terms of people understanding the Chinese activity and where we are today. And, I think we are on the right path. You know what? I don't think we can move down that path fast enough.
Yeah, I mean, the announcement that Hong Kong elections have been postponed for a year.
It's obvious that the Chinese have gotten more aggressive. And if you look at it again from kind of Xi's perspective, he's the one that really made the decision in the last 10 years to kind of take the curtain off and really reveal their really ambitious decisions and say, we have now, as China, we've accumulated all this power and authority, and we need to go out and use it. And for him to back down from that strategy essentially would be a tremendous loss of face, and I think would really shake up his authority. So he doesn't show any signs, essentially, of backing off. But what's interesting about the Chinese, where are they really stepping out? They're stepping out on those that are the weakest, right? So they go after Hong Kong because they can, because Hong Kong can't really effectively fight back. So it is very much bullying tactics.
Well, and what's the reasoning though for postponing the election? What are they giving? COVID?
I don't know. I've been tracking it that closely.
Yeah, who cares? I mean, the reason is propaganda, whatever it is.
Right.
It's just a repression of people seeking freedom. But
you've already seen them kind of kick out pro-democracy candidates. So very clear, it doesn't matter. I mean, what the Chinese government is trying to show, the days of autonomy and independence are over, and we call the shots now, and nobody should question that.
Are they being encouraged by congressional Democrat socialists in this country? It seems to be. DiFi called the Chinese communists a respectable nation. House Speaker Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer chastised the president for referring to America's adversaries, China, Russia, and Iran, in the same sentence, saying, quote, the statement gives a false sense of equivalence to the actions of foreign adversaries by listing three countries of unequal intent, motivation, and capability together. Oh, gosh, I hope we didn't offend China, Russia, or Iran by grouping them as the three.
Well, look, I mean, we are in this silly political season, and, since day one of this administration, for the president's opponents, it's been, if he's for it, they're against it. We've lost the sense of kind of politics end at the nation's shores, and saying things which essentially are regurgitating the things our enemies say. But we just don't see that in a foreign context. We see this domestically. I mean, look at the violence in Portland, which is absolutely indisputable, and how many of the president's opponents are attacking the president, attacking the administration for defending federal property and denying that there is violence and criminal activity going on.
What violence? Jim Clyburn he doesn't even know what courthouse you're talking about. With respect to China, though, and those statements, go back to Pompeo's statement about influence operations in the United States. I mean, do we see them taking a particular interest in the presidential outcome? So there's both sides there. One is there foreign activity in the United States? Absolutely. Are we in much better shape to respond and deal with the most malicious and dangerous activity than we were in 2016? Absolutely. I mean, I think the federal government spends a lot of time at looking at foreign, not just influence operation, but actually efforts to kind of shift votes and stuff like that. So, and they actually get a lot of cooperation from big tech on this. Here's the challenge, though, I think, is how influential are foreign influence operations? Because especially when you see, people in this country essentially saying the same things as China and Russia and everything else, how much are they really moving the needle? I think our domestic discord drives the conversation a lot more. I think where the government, where the national security folks, law enforcement get much, much more concerned is influence operations that are stoking the fires at the real radical fringe on the left and, on the right. When violence becomes normal, and we've seen this in organized movements all over the world, all through history, there's always a fringe element that says that's not enough. And when you have mainstream kind of saying, hey, you're kind of tamping that down. Now you're starting to give us a bad name. There's always people that think we need to drive that a little further. If you remember, for example, back in the 70s, when the Palestinian Authority was using terrorism, and then Arafat entered into talks with Sadat in Egypt, there were people that thought, well, the PLA is just too moderate. And there were splinter groups that were trying to be even more violent. And I do think that is something that we have to give a second thought to. Once violence becomes normalized, the notion that there are going to be splinter groups that think that, not to pick on anybody, but BLM and Antifa, they're just too mainstream. That's when you have to start worrying about, people doing really horrific things. And the president's decision to bring 6,400 troops home from Germany and reassign another 5,600, is this his last gift to Putin, as CNN breathlessly characterized it, or is this, one, fulfilling a promise, and two, attaching consequences to Germany's failure to pay their fair share?
Well, I don't think either of those things are true. I don't think this is anything about Putin, and I don't really think it impacts punishing Germany in any way. This is the administration trying to figure out how do we actually get better conventional deterrence with the forces that we have. I think part of this makes sense. The Air Force moves probably make sense from a lot of different perspectives. Better places you can put those planes more effectively, cost-effectively use them, make them safer, really expand the areas that NATO can influence. So the Air Force decision, I'm kind of okay with. I think that the idea of having a rotational force that can come back to Europe and other places, that's a good idea. I don't think this is the right unit to move, and if we were going to move operational forces, we should actually be moving them forward, principally in Poland. So parts of this decision I think are fine. Parts of it I don't think are the best move. But you know what? These are actually the kind of debates strategists have. But it's not. Everybody's assigning all these political motives to this, which I just don't think are there.
Well, SecDef Esper said that this move was to promote the larger strategic goals to actually deter Russia and reassure European allies, suggesting that shifting forces further east into the Black Sea and the Baltic regions would do precisely that.
Well, it will, but and that's good. Like I said, there are parts of this deal I like. There are parts of it I don't. We really need we do need U.S. I think a U.S. forward deployed force in Poland would help a lot. It would really reassure the Poles. It would make them much more likely to support the Baltic states. If Ukraine ever came into NATO, it would make it much more easy to reinforce Ukraine. So there's good logic to also have forward deployed forces. I mean, I think that, quite honestly, the difference between me and the Secretary of Defense is he would say rotational forces are going to enhance conventional deterrence. My argument is look, it's rotational forces and forward presence. It's belt and suspenders. Because look at what you're talking about here. You're talking about deterring Putin from doing a smash and grab, grabbing part of NATO before NATO can do anything about it, having NATO just fall apart. I don't want that to happen. I want a belt and suspenders, right? I don't want to have a debate about are suspenders better than belts. I want both.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we should be. But that's a strategic debate. It's not really a debate about politics.
That's the same thing our governor has to choose every morning, belt and suspenders, to keep it all together. I get it. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Jim, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
A storm is on the horizon, and you need to keep the lights on no matter what. Your business relies on the power being on 24/7. It's the lifeblood of your data and computer systems. Weather-related outages from the power company are not acceptable. Your need for a source of power that's reliable 24/7, along with round-the-clock service that can dispatch technicians to your site immediately, is mission critical. Your business needs Charles Equipment Energy Systems on speed dial. These are the big boys, not residential or solar, but reliable industrial generators for emergency backup or events. When you need more than a 100-foot extension cord plugged into a small engine generator, call Charles Equipment Energy Systems. They keep the lights on with rental generators for job sites or power outages. The storm season is here. Plan ahead. Call now to prepare generators for sudden damage and potential power outages. Call 630-834-6000. That's 630